Okay. Right, comrades. Of course, as we say many times in our meetings, we're living in the most volatile and explosive times. Dangerous economic turbulence, a major war in Europe, an unprecedented polarization of wealth and poverty, a looming climate catastrophe, the rise of the far right, including in the governments of several European countries now, a growing wave of strikes and protests worldwide, and of course, most lately, the countrywide riots and protests in France. And then suddenly last weekend, out of the blue, a mutiny and abortive coup attempt in the hitherto relatively stable authoritarian regime in Russia. Now, WIN has been holding weekly discussion meetings over the last 3.5 years to review, monitor, and gain an insight into such events. And today we're happy to welcome Richard Sakwa, an acknowledged authority on contemporary Russia, both as a respected academic and a popular writer, and we're grateful to him for his acceptance, especially at short notice, of our invitation. Now, particularly today, in the context of the horrific war in Ukraine, a question on which we encompass a wide range of different views, the politics of Russia is an especially controversial topic. But WIN has never aimed at unanimity. We welcome lively democratic debate because it helps enlighten us all. It's an indispensable factor in helping us all gain a deeper insight. And we in WIN are proud of our consistent practice of this tradition. So today too, there will be ample opportunity for a free and comradely exchange of opinions, and I'm confident we will all equally benefit from the discussion. As chair of today's meeting, I will ensure that this principle will be upheld, that we will all enjoy an equal opportunity to express our opinions and to listen to one another with mutual respect. And that as a result, we'll all leave today's meeting with a sharper and clearer understanding of the issues. So, Richard, as soon as you're ready, please go ahead.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon or this morning, if that's the case. In my chat, I'll be talking, you asked about 25, 30 minutes. I'm going to deal with 4 bundles of issues. The first one being indeed precisely the Prigozhin-Wagner business of last week, which he alluded to. The second one will be, my second topic, will be the effect or the context of how the war itself is going. The third one will focus more on Russia itself. And a fourth bundle of topics will, I've provisionally called it, the political crisis of our time, which will try to contextualize it. Some of you may recognize that term, the political crisis of our time, as an article by that great political philosopher, controversial one, Leo Strauss. But I'll leave that to the end. So the bigger issues. Okay, so the first bundle of issues. So what happened last week? What was it all about? What's the context? The Wagner, Prigozhin, well, first of all, even what to call it. It wasn't a coup attempt, clearly, because the goal was not to overthrow Putin or the regime itself. It was more in the nature of a mutiny, or even as the Russians like to call it today, a bunt, a bunt, meaning which Pushkin described as a classic Russian bunt, a merciless and senseless. So what actually happened? The first thing to say is, of course, is that the Wagner Group, which of course took the lead in the fighting over Bakhmut, the town of Bakhmut, Solidar before that, Bakhmut known as Artyomovsk also, that it's just one of these private military companies, PMCs, which have actually no status in Russian law. So once the 4 oblasts, Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, had been incorporated into Russia, it made their status even more ambiguous. Of course, this Wagner Group has fought in Africa, in Libya, and in Syria as well. But it was only one of them. We also should remember that there was at least 25,000, I say we don't know the numbers, Cossacks fighting. There's also the group from Chechnya, the Kadyrovtsi, which are called, actually have an official military designation, but everybody knows them as a Kadyrovtsi. And that tells you a lot about the Russian state today, which is a type of neoliberal authoritarianism. They've outsourced things. I'll come back to that issue, but it's an outsourcing of power, and it's a very peculiar phenomenon. And it really is at the heart of how we can begin to understand this. It's an argument which I've been making for many, many years, that the Russian system is a system, or Putin himself type of governance, is based on balancing factions. A fancy word for it is heterarchy rather than hierarchy. Everybody looks at Russia and thinks of it as some sort of a highly disciplined vertical of power, with Putin sitting at the top. He pushes a button, pulls a lever, and something happens in Vladivostok or Krasnoyarsk or Perm. It doesn't work like that. It's never worked like that. It's a system based on endless, well, I was going to use the word checks and balances, but it isn't that in a classic constitutional sense. These are checks or balances within not the state, but within the regime. And I've for years distinguished between type of dual state, where you have a regime which which can be democratic, which can is responsive to public needs and goods, but it certainly it's, if you like, parasitic on the state itself. Its legitimacy comes from the panoply of constitutional institutions, that is, political parties, elections, parliament, constitutional court, all of that. Yet its power stands over and above it, a regime. Many people have actually made the argument that a similar type of system now exists in the United States, where you have a Trumanite state, the military-industrial complex established in the early Cold War years, the one that you remember that communist Eisenhower, who condemned it in his farewell speech in 1961, the military-industrial complex. And then you have the Madisonian state, the correlative, that is when you have elections, a rotation of presidents, and so on. Yet ultimately, policy, once it was established in the post-war years, I'm talking about militarism, military bases, etc., remains. So this distinction, Michael Glennon has done a book on this. It's just to reference it. And Russia is an extreme case of that as well, where you actually have this dualism at its heart. And it's fundamentally important to understand where we are today with, I'll go back to Wagner in a minute, but you have this system, which I nowadays call the political West. The political West was established in the post-war years, led by the United States, and it's very much a creature of the Cold War. There's militarism, 800 US bases, etc., etc. And so that helps explain Russia's response to it is also distinctive. As I say, it's this sort of, rather than a simple system of hierarchy, and where some people talk about, well, I talk about, the rhizome, this plants, daisies, for example, propagate not by seed, but by spreading sideways. Well, that's the Russian model. Prigozhin took advantage of it, and that explains why you have these PMCs, you actually have the regular army, but you also have all of these other bodies fighting. So, of course, Prigozhin himself is a fascinating individual. In a sense, it's not praising it, but simply saying it's an extraordinary phenomenon. The fact that he managed to gain such a strong position. His personal relationship with Putin goes back to 1990s, early 1990s, when Putin himself became the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg under the Democratic mayor, Anatoly Sobchak. And they got to know each other in the early 1990s. Prigozhin himself, of course, spent several years in the 1980s in jail. He was convicted for 8 years in jail for house burglary, or as the Americans would say, burglarizing. So it's it goes back. So in a sense that the betrayal of what happened last weekend was double for Putin. It was a person with whom he's worked for 30 years, somebody he's one of that St. Petersburg mafia, as they call it, and of course the military side of it after all of this. So it's it was Wagner had become a proxy. He'd done all sorts of things, but most notably, Prigozhin himself was involved in the 2016 US presidential election with Donald Trump, if you remember, and the Russiagate scandal. I've written a book about it. And Prigozhin had this Internet Research Institute Association in St. Petersburg, which was trolling the American public, yes, but it was marginal, all sorts of literature about it. Yet Hillary Clinton and the Democrats basically argued that Putin put Trump into the White House. And this endless amount of arguments that Trump was the Manchurian candidate and a Putin cat's paw. There was no evidence for this. No evidence whatsoever. I mean, yes, Prigozhin's people from the people in St. Petersburg did have elements of involvement in the election, but it was marginal. So it goes back all that way. And of course, once the war began, it was very useful for Putin to make service of this. So, but of course, this mutiny was defeated remarkably quickly. The grievances, why Wagner actually did it, of course, was because on the decision had been taken earlier in June, on the 11th of June, that all the Wagner soldiers who had actually distinguished themselves in the battle for Artyomovsk, Bakhmut, had to sign a contract with the regular Minister of Defence. In other words, Wagner was being disbanded. So that was clearly the trigger, which for all of this. But also, the second factor involved is that Prigozhin had political ambitions within Russia itself. He has emerged over the last few months in ever more radical, ever more in my view, irresponsible statements. He had been condemning not just the Ministry of Defense, the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, the head of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, but he'd also become the leader of what are called the angry patriots. So those of us in the West who read The Guardian and so on, or who used to, would always look to the liberals as the major alternative to Putin. Anybody who knows Russia knows that the major opposition for the last 10 years at least, or 15 years, has come from the nationalist right. There were riots in Moscow in 2010, and it's been the nationalists and the angry patriots, and Prigozhin put himself at the head of all of this. He's been blogging and Telegram channels and so on. And so, it was quite clear that he was going to do. So we know it was Putin handled it well. Debates about whether it's left him weakened or stronger. I shall go back to that in my next point. But simply to say that Prigozhin now has gone to Belarus in a deal brokered by Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. There's a huge compound being built there. The mass of the Wagner forces did not get involved in this bunt, in this mutiny. And of course, the regular Russian military remained loyal to Putin. I think that Prigozhin assumed that he'd actually, his at the head of the angry patriots, there'd be a mass uprising, that the military would split, all sorts of stuff, which was absolute nonsense. And clearly he is now a busted flush. So my second point is, the effect, what does this mean for the war? Well, as the Wagner revolt, mutiny took place, clearly we have illustrious scholars in the West, people like Graham Allison from Harvard, who says Kiev must seize this moment. So in other words, the assumption was that Russia was in disarray, that this was the time to launch, an even more vigorous counter-offensive and to take advantage of it. Russia today controls about 17% of Ukraine, 17% of the 1991 bordered Ukraine. So it was certainly a vision of that. However, there is no evidence that the military has in any way shaken its strategy. Now, what I'm going to say next isn't a sign of approbation, it's simply a fact that basically Russia has been fighting this war in an extremely effective manner. That contrary to what this vast flood of Western commentary, SMS, or MSM, mainstream media stuff, it's after its early reverses, but even those reverses last year was within the logic of what they were trying to do. I mean, Russia invaded not to take over all of Ukraine, but to open a negotiation channel and finally to get the West, the political West, this hermetic closed enlarging body with NATO and so on, to listen to Russian security concerns. And the idea was that, and it nearly won. That strategy of shock and awe, though it wasn't shock and awe because anything like the Anglo-American shock and awe on Baghdad or Belgrade. I've just come back from Serbia in 1999 and in Iraq in 2003, was nothing of the sort. And that initial strategy almost worked. There was a deal based from Istanbul on the 1st of April 2022, where Zelensky, president of Ukraine, accepted neutrality and some other conditions. And as you know, then Boris Johnson, our disgraced former prime minister, flew in at Washington's behest. We now know that, at Washington's behest, to tell the Ukrainian government and Zelensky not to enter into negotiations, not to save the merciless slaughter of tens of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian boys and some women as well. It was which in other words, the peace deal was on offer, is probably at that time is probably the one that sooner or later will have to be imposed. So this war was always eminently avoidable, ultimately futile, yet and it'll end probably the way it could have ended a year and a half ago. Since then, Russia's dug in, and its military strategy has not been to gain more territory, but it is to erode the fighting capacity of the Ukrainian army, a war of attrition. And that's what Wagner Group did brilliantly in Bakhmut, Artyomovsk. In other words, for some reason, which I can't understand, and anybody who knows military, I certainly don't, but military people tell me that quite clearly it was Zelensky did the same as Hitler did in Stalingrad, basically threw good forces after forces which were already lost. And for some reason, Zelensky made Bakhmut Zelensky's last stand. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and equipment were destroyed, again, pointlessly from a strategic point of view. And this is what, of course, is going on with this counteroffensive. The counteroffensive, of course, is continuing today, purely to get to a better position for negotiations and, of course, to show the credibility of Ukrainian forces at the forthcoming NATO summit on the 10th and 11th of July in Vilnius. So it's a disaster. I mean, simply tens of thousands of boys, my heart goes out to them. I mean, really is for basically to suit the needs of the political West. So it really is tragic. Can I just make one point on talking about the war? That on negotiations, and of course that's a whole separate subject. There's, at the moment, there is effectively no legal Ukrainian state in terms of negotiating partner for Russia, since both Poroshenko, the previous president, and Zelensky have denounced the mutual recognition treaty between Russia and Ukraine. The first one was signed in the autumn of 1990. So on the 1st of April 2019, basically, I mean, both administrations, there was the overlap, it was still under Poroshenko, basically denounced the relationship, the diplomatic relationship. So in other words, as far as Moscow is concerned, there is no legal, and of course vice versa, which of course makes it even more intractable. And in fact, neither of them, and of course the amount of hatred and violence which has now been stirred up, is that there's no basic negotiations. And I can see that time's moving on. I'll move on to my third section briefly. And I've already said some comments about Russia itself, but it's that model of Russian politics, which I outlined at the beginning. Just a few more words on that. Is again, clearly since 2020, Russia has become a far more intensely authoritarian system. This was before the war, but in part prompted by preparations for this war. Once it was clear that the Minsk Accord, which was designed, the second one of February 2015, which the goal was to give a degree of autonomy to the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, wasn't going to be implemented, Russia began to move towards a war footing, including, for example, getting more and more financial reserves to withstand it. Of course, they didn't expect that 300 billion held in Western banks was going to be frozen. That they did not anticipate. But the whole economy, import substitution, so in other words, Russia has been preparing for this war, just like Ukraine has since 2014. And so has the West. And, the fact that the British and Americans were pumping in more and more, Obama was hesitant, and then since then pumping in more and more weapons. Also the fact that the Ukrainians had built what the equivalent of the Atlantic Wall, what I call the Donetsk Wall. Absolutely amazing. All along the DNR and LNR, this is vast concrete, reinforced concrete emplacements, tunnels, everything. It's just incredible what they're doing it with 60,000 crack Ukrainian troops on the days before the war in February 2022, poised on the other side. So this was everybody expected war except the media and some academics like me. I expected it, but I assumed that it would be a relatively limited operation. The ambition, of course, wasn't anticipated. But it also, what I'm saying is that the war has achieved an internal transformation of the regime within Russia. It has been obviously authoritarian for quite a long time, but the constitutional reform of 2020 was, a signal that there'd been a type of regime transformation taking place, the jailing or trying to kill Alexei Navalny, all sorts of other things going on, which intensified domestic repression, was, to prepare the ground for a war that the leadership thought would come. Of course, I could, talk quite a lot about the literal decision-making in the very days before the war, which is very important, reflects it. But the key question for us today is, did this Prigozhin-Wagner mutiny, has it actually undermined Putin's rule? Is Putin weaker? There's a vast flood of literature on this. My bottom line today is that Putin has emerged not weaker, certainly not stronger, but it's basically, it was a relatively marginal event. Ultimately, that Putin managed it. He's made several speeches in the last few days. The military stayed strong. There's been the morale of Russian forces in Ukraine is very high. They believe that this war was taken to them by the political West, that for 30 years Russia has been excluded from the European security order, and that ultimately, as Putin nowadays says, we should, and Sergei Karaganov and other leading Russian politicians, this is something we should have done 2 or 3 years ago, before Ukraine had become so strong, before it had built that Donetsk wall, and so on and so forth. Again, that's not to endorse the position, it's simply to say that's what happened. And of course, a lot of commentary in the last few days has opened up the abyss, if you like, that, for example, I have, an article here, from the New Statesman, this week's New Statesman. It says, worse could follow Putin. And it's absolutely right that whatever one may think of Putin, that he is the relative moderate. One of the things or goals of the Prigozhin mutiny was for Russia to pursue this war with more vigor, to establish a war economy, to militarize society, to turn it into a North Korea. He used that term a couple of months ago, and to really hammer the Ukrainians and the West. Of course, Prigozhin himself has gone quite crazy, because in the days before the mutiny, he was saying exact opposite, and there are plenty of rumors. Certainly, I haven't got the evidence that he was in contact with the Ukrainian intelligence service as well. So there's things we still don't know about it, but clearly he went quite bonkers in his last few weeks, as he knew that the days of Wagner in Europe were numbered. They would still have probably an African presence and so on. So is Putin weakened? No. Is this the door to the post-Putin years? No. Will worse? Almost certainly, Putin is the moderate in all of this, and that he is still trying to fight this war as a relatively insulated conflict, which will not affect daily life. I've been to Moscow twice since the war's begun, and it's daily life continues. That McDonald's, for example, has left, and its 870 stores have been rebranded, and the Big Mac or whatever it was is exactly slightly the same, slightly different, but basically the same as it was. And in fact, this company which took over from McDonald's, and it's rebranded the stores Vkusna Itochka, tasty, and that's it, have actually in this last year made a greater profit turnover than it did in the last pre-war years under McDonald's ownership. So in other words, daily life continues as normal, and the economy is proved remarkably resilient. More than that, in some ways, there's the economic argument to say that what Russia is now doing, it should say a huge thank you to the West, because what it is doing is pursuing an industrial strategy of the sort that it would not be able to do in peacetime. We're talking about full, developing now, already had a domestic shipbuilding industry, a aircraft building industry, both military and civilian, and everything else, and microprocessors, obviously very backward in that, but nevertheless developing. And as Putin says, the military factories are working on 3 shifts, 24/7, putting out the production. And as I said right from the beginning, this is a war that Ukraine cannot win. Of course, it's a war that Russia can't win either, because the danger and why Putin is maintaining this relative moderate line, because he fears that the Poles, the Lithuanians, and the British, the most irresponsible and warmongering of the lot, will try some sort of flanking move of invading, for example, Belarus, occupying Western Ukraine, and so on, if Russia really took the hand off put the foot on the accelerator for a real war. We're talking about a war, an Anglo-American style war, where they destroyed every single ministry, every single important installation in Baghdad within the first week, and of course the same in Libya when they destroyed the modern Libyan state. We destroyed the modern Libyan state in March, April 2011. Russia has not done that. Yes, it's after the attack on the Kerch Bridge, there's been a response each time Ukraine or the West, the political West, ramps up the pressure. For example, attacking energy facilities last winter after the attack on the Kerch Bridge on the 8th of October, and so on. So each ratcheting up an escalation from the West has met a response, yes, but so far relatively not as much as Prigozhin and the Wagner types wanted. So that takes me to the final section, which really isn't, I can't go into it in depth, but all of this terrible position and situation is all of this is a symptom of the larger political crisis of our time. And it's very difficult to know what language to use in all of this. There's all sorts of elements of this political crisis of our time. For example, I have a piece here by Boris Kagarlitsky. Some of you will know him as a notable socialist in Russia, a Russian socialist. I know him quite well. And Boris Kagarlitsky, who has put forward a peace plan, but from the classic Russian left or liberal perspective, which is now joined, is basically saying that that those of us in the West who are calling for peace, for negotiations, a ceasefire, an armistice of some form, that we are effectively supporting the Russian military operation. I don't accept that for a minute, but basically, it's one element of this political crisis of our time is the failure of the left and the anti-war movement to, I'm not saying that you guys, but this is a common task for us all to establish a platform which encompasses the Russian left and the Ukrainian left. There's plenty of people in Ukraine, Vladimir Ishchenko is one of them, and many, many more, who are also horrified by the pointlessness and the stupidity and the savagery of this war, which simply has to come to an end without, as I say, it was a war. So that's one element, the political crisis of our time, and that is the crisis of the left, which I'm sure you guys and we all talk about nonstop, the crisis of the peace movement, and how weak it is when there was the Vietnam War. There was mass marches, and of course the dangers of nuclear war. But more about this political crisis of our time is also the role of the media has really disgraced itself over the Prigozhin Wagner thing last week. But of course, it's over the coverage of this war has been abysmal. I simply cannot watch. I used to subscribe to The Guardian, have done since I was a boy, but I've had to stop that. And when other mainstream media, there's plenty of good coverage. And one of the interesting things today is, in the United States in particular, there's plenty, and this is why I really immediately accepted an invitation to talk to you, your group, because one of the few forums where I think genuine open discussion of these fundamental issues is taking place, whereas it isn't taking place. For example, I used to be an associate member of Chatham House, and they're now talking about simply one thing: pumping in more weapons, really winning and taking this war to Russia. And ultimately, I mean, they're talking certainly for Ukraine, but implicitly talking about regime change within Russia. So the very basic framework of international politics is challenged as never before. And by that, I mean, in particular, the Charter International System, the UN-based system. The United Nations has become a forum for the continuation of conflict rather than a framework for its resolution. I've been reading in this week's edition of the London Review of Books. There's a marvelous article about Ralph Bunche, who was the Deputy Under-Secretary under the very first General Secretaries, Tigvili and others in the United Nations, and how marvelous and how effective they were. I mean, they never, obviously the United Nations is only as strong as the political will of the past, but made a genuine effort to resolve conflict. Not today, and many other elements of the crisis in the media, the attempt to cancel Russia, which is just outrageous, and the imposition of collective guilt on the Russian people, not just collective responsibility, but collective guilt, which is unprecedented. When Anglo-Americans destroyed Libya and Serbia, did we have sanctions imposed on the US and Britain? Or when we supported the slaughter in Yemen for so many years, did we have British players banned from playing in Wimbledon and so on? You may say it is invidious comparison. I don't think so, because the Russian people, 10% opinion polls show, are opposed to this war, just like any other society. So it's a war which was, again, I don't want to go into John Mearsheimer line and so on, but clearly it was avoidable that certain forces wanted this war to take place, to destroy Russia, to take it out from circulation before the political West takes on China. So the political crisis of our time has all sorts of dimensions to it, which I can only just begin to allude to, but I think it's something that certainly I'm focusing on in my work today. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. That was a really clear exposition of a point of view. I know it's not going to be accepted by all the comrades here, and as you say, we're proud of our tradition of being an open forum where we collectively discuss these ideas in order to reach a clearer understanding and a clearer insight. So thank you very much, Richard, for that. I see that so far we've got 2 hands up. Ed first.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much, Richard, for a very, very interesting and well presented summary of these events. My contribution is really more questions than any assertions. I remember at the very beginning of this war, the first couple of weeks, there was news coverage, quite a lot of news coverage, certainly on sort of unofficial media, of protests by citizens in Russia against the start of this war. People being dragged off the street, grandmas and people like that being dragged off the street by police for protesting against their sons being taken to war. I assumed that was quite a widespread movement at the beginning of the war, which was quickly clamped down on by the authorities. Am I right? Is there still a groundswell of opposition within Russia to this war? To what extent is it organized? To what extent is it able to make its voice heard in society? And is there any scope for developing links between socialists in the West and that kind of movement? Because after all, what we are striving for is workers' internationalism, so that we can begin to put an end to all capitalist wars. I also remember news commentary about spiraling prices in the shops in Russia at the beginning of this war. What's been the economic effect for ordinary people of this war? Are there shortages? I mean, you've, I think, very, very full of insight. You made this point that, from the West point of view, it's take Russia out first as a preliminary to a war between the West and China. What are the kind of complications really of that strategy for the West? Because it doesn't seem so easy to take out Russia as perhaps some Western strategists thought. The final, again, it's a question. You made this sort of comparison with the Vietnam War, and you said that there was a mass movement in the West against the Vietnam War, but there hasn't been a mass movement in the West against this war. But are we not dealing with hugely different timescales? The Vietnam War actually started around about the 1950s in the form of a war against French control of Vietnam, and was taken over by the Americans some decades later. And then after years of Americans being bogged down, then there was a big youth opposition movement to the Vietnam War. From the point of view of that historical timescale of decades, this war is very, very new, and it hasn't had time yet to result in the kind of opposition that we saw in relation to Vietnam. Am I getting something wrong there? That's it. That's the questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Ed. I think
Okay,
all excellent points.
Richard, sorry, can I just see if there's any more direct questions? I know there's a number of comrades will want to come into the discussion, but before Richard answers that, are any direct questions for him? If not, go ahead, Richard. Yeah.
Thanks. Yep. So as for the protest against the war, you're absolutely spot on. In the first weeks, there was, according to this Russian information agency, Ovd Info, there were about, between 15 and 19,000 people arrested. So you're absolutely right. It looked as if this had provoked a whole element, but the repression was very severe. And so the costs of taking part in anti-war activities of any form are extremely high. And some of the sentencing, for example, one of the leaders of the political opposition, Ilya Yashin, was given a sentence not long ago, 8.5 years. Vladimir Kara-Murza has been given a very long jail sentence. So there is the protest. There is an undercurrent of opposition to the war. Absolutely, but not organized. Not organized. Any organized opposition is the only major organized, if you like, opposition wants to intensify the war rather than end it. As I said, from the nationalists, from the right, from people like Igor Girkin, Strelkov, and others. So it's and indeed the Communist Party, which is the major opposition party, so-called opposition party, the communists, are a mixture of nationalists, orthodoxy, and patriotism, want again to see this war intensified. So far this war has been done, well, not entirely. I was going to say outsourced, because the Wagner was clearly outsourced in Kadyrovtsi and the Cossacks, but it's element. So yeah, so it's very difficult to. There's no organized anti-war movement, and though with workers, as far as the mass of opinion polls show, that support for the war is relatively high. The major protest is emigration. That when the war was declared, maybe 500,000 people left, and then when the mobilization of last September, another 500,000 left. I was at the border between Murmansk and into Murmansk region and Norway, and they told me that after the mobilization was announced last year on the 21st of September, that there was a half-mile queue of cars to leave Russia. So the opposition is outside, and of course they're now mobilizing outside Russia quite significantly. But I'm not sure that I certainly don't want to be very close with many of these people, because their goal is to have revolution in Russia, to overthrow Putin. And as Mikhail Khodorkovsky put it in a tweet and then in an article soon after the Wagner Bund of the 23rd and 24th of June, that the goal is revolution, and it could be violent in Russia, and that in a nuclear, with the world's largest nuclear holdings, is not something I want to see. And indeed, it's not something the people want, because Putin is supported, whether one likes it or not. Prices have gone up about 10 to 15%, but there's no shortages. In fact, there's more shortages in a British shop than there are. And we're talking about not just in Moscow, but we're talking across the country. It is very well supplied. And in fact, it's actually said that when the sanctions were first imposed over Ukraine in 2014, it has led to a massive agricultural boom, including an enormous amount of new, and this is very important for Russian intelligentsia, cheese production. And Russian cheese, which I've always liked, is no worse than many of our Western brands. So no shortages, prices have gone up. And of course, the prices have gone up. Today, for example, there's a surplus of iPhones because of parallel imports, grey imports coming in through Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, so on. By the way, just on that point, it reminds me that there's 10 million guest workers from Central Asia in Russia today, 2 million more than before the war began. And it's still, for many of the Central Asian states, remittances are one of the, I think in Tajikistan, it's nearly 50% of GDP. And China, just to say that, yes, I mean, clearly, if Washington had any sense, they would ally with Moscow against China, as Kissinger would recommend. And so that's not going to work. As for Vietnam War, I think you're absolutely right. The timescales are very different. So I just said it at the end. Clearly, this the whole situation is very different. So I very much take your point, and I think you're absolutely right. And of course, what made the protest Vietnam War was conscription in the United States, and mostly poor boys and black people and minorities and working class people were sent off to Vietnam. So it was clearly other issues involved. So I take your point, and you're absolutely right. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Richard. Right, we have a number of comrades who are waiting to come in. I'll take Finn first.
Thanks, comrades. Richard is mistaken in his explanation of the causes of the war. Very mistaken. And it's an extraordinary claim to make that the war was intended to open a communications channel. So we've got hundreds of thousands of people dead. 6 million people have had to leave the Ukraine. A further 5 million within Ukraine are internally displaced. There's an economic crisis across the country, and we're witnessing slaughter and destruction on an unprecedented scale, and then barbarism and torture and crimes against humanity, all attributable to the invading forces of Russia. And to describe that as a method of opening a communications channel is an extraordinary claim to make, and is completely wrong. When Putin made it clear, absolutely clear, that he didn't think Ukraine should exist at all as an independent state. And the last thing he wants is an independent, sovereign, and prosperous state in Ukraine. He doesn't even accept that Ukrainians as a people have a right to a state. And he's made that clear. When he invaded Ukraine initially, he wanted to take over the entire country. And people who were watching television at the time will see the newsreel, which showed a line of invading tanks 35 kilometers long, heading towards Kyiv. And that was prevented by mobilizations of ordinary Ukrainians. Hundreds of thousands of people getting involved in various ways in resisting the initial Russian invasion. So to call that a matter of a communications channel is extraordinary. A further point, which Richard is also false on and incorrect on, is the attribution of normality in Russian society. He talks about the McDonald's Big Mac still being available, about prices not rising that much in the shops. Even to call Putin a moderate in any context is completely incorrect and takes us all in the wrong direction politically. Then he makes the other comparison that Russia is a bit like the United States. No, there are no free trade unions in Russia. Journalists and opposition people are thrown into prison. There are no free and independent courts. The entire society is repressive and totally undemocratic. There are enormous problems in America. Nobody on this discussion would have any good word to say about the regime in America. But to make the comparison that America, which is the point you made, Richard, can be compared to Russia, is false. It's incorrect. There's lots of what you say is interesting in a discursive type of an approach. But in a discussion of this nature, where we're trying to find cause and effect, it doesn't serve any purpose. The Russians invaded a sovereign country, and the Ukrainians are resisting the invasion of their country, and we should demand the withdrawal now of all the invading forces of Russia from Ukraine. The notion that somehow the war is attributable to the West is a certain validity in an argument against NATO, but to attribute the war to that is wrong. The uprising in Maidan in 2004 exposed a lot of the problems. Yanukovych was a corrupt individual. He was operating in the interests of Putin. And when he was overthrown by a mass popular uprising, with perhaps 500,000 people on the streets in Maidan, involving workers and students and ordinary people. There were also other forces involved, of course, left-wing forces, anarchist forces, religious influences, fascists and right-wing, they all got involved. But it was a mass popular uprising against Yanukovych, who was Putin's stooge in Ukraine. When Yanukovych was overthrown by that popular movement, Putin feared a similar movement happening in his own country, in Russia, against him. And that's one of the reasons he invaded Georgia, or Russia invaded Georgia, in 2008. What Putin fears most is a democratic movement within Russia that might be well inspired by the movements in other countries. It was Putin who used the expression that the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014 was a coup. It wasn't a coup. It was a mass popular movement, the consequence of which was the corrupt and self-regarding leader Yanukovych was kicked out. He was corrupt. He was extremely wealthy. There were many reasons why the movement mobilized against him. One of the issues that emerged was the question about the European Union. Putin wanted an agreement between Ukraine and Russia in terms of trade. And Ukraine was moving towards making a deal with the European Union. I mean, that's not a crime. The European Union is a voluntary association of states. The question that Putin was worried about is that he wanted to enhance the trade relationship with Ukraine. So his reasons for invading Ukraine are not about opening a communications channel. They're about the destruction and the obliteration of Ukraine as a nation and as an independent and separate people. So these are, strong points of disagreement. The discussion of these points can be useful, but the fundamental question we face now is that Russia should withdraw its troops from the country, Ukraine, that it has illegally invaded. Ukraine has a right to self-determination like all nations. And in any settlement discussions that might happen following a ceasefire or wherever, there would then be discussion about the rights of the people of Donbass and Luhansk and other regions, Crimea, where you might have a plebiscite to resolve the question of what the peoples require in these states. But that wasn't, Putin pretended that his invasion of Ukraine was somewhat connected to the, what he called independent republics in Luhansk, Donbass, and that region. If that was the case, why did he have his tanks all steaming towards Kyiv? So there's lots of contradictions in your presentation. It's useful to have a discussion of these questions. They're always useful. But I think, Richard, you've made some fundamental, from a socialist and left-wing and Marxist perspective, you've contained in your contribution fundamental errors, fundamental lacks of judgment, and fundamental dangers for the left, generally in the left. To have any kind of illusions whatsoever in Russia and the way that you're presenting it as Russia being normal and Putin being a moderate, I mean, it is absolute garbage. So having said that, thank you for attending the discussion. I hope the discussion develops and some of these points are dealt with by comrades. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Finn, for an equally sharp and clear exposition of an alternative point of view. I think next is David.
Well, from my side, thank you, Richard, for introducing the discussion and, in a sense, for sharpening up the discussion that we are having in our own ranks, and the left is also having very extensively. And as a South African, I can say that many South Africans on the left would support the position in that remain the headlines of the position that you've taken, although in the recent past, they haven't and are in retreat. And it's quite significant that the very corrupt ANC regime has actually pleaded with Putin to end the war and end it immediately or as soon as possible, which is kind of unexpected from a semi-colonial country which was hoping to get some deal with Russia. Can I try and set the war in context? What we have here worldwide is if I could put it quite frankly, a fossil fuel state, a state which is based on petroleum and oil as its main production. It may now be trying to industrialize at a late stage, but it doesn't have any significant industry, and its wealth comes out of the petrodollars and the other foreign exchange that it's been able to assemble in the past period. That is an indication of a state which is completely reckless in terms of climate change. The whole world now is sucked into this war. It's true. And the oil prices have soared, the revenues to all kinds of vassal states, as we see in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, have now become enormously rich. In South Africa, you know, these various traditional leaders there are heading to South Africa to enjoy a great time with 60 Russian prostitutes in tow and so forth. I mean, it's a very ugly situation, you know, which has developed worldwide with a complete contempt for our roller coaster pursuit of climate change destruction and devastation, as we've seen in many parts, including South Africa now, where we've just had major floods at a time of winter where we've never previously had rain. In other words, devastation is being wreaked on the global south, and in Russia is completely mindless in relation to this. Putin and you know, all the assembled blood, and now we've seen this invasion. And my argument is that Russia's wealth, in a sense, is assembled out of this. The war itself has buffeted, the Russian economy, because it pushed oil prices up, has kept them up, for some time, when the world should be moving towards renewables. So it's a kind of a late state, an attempt to develop, and it's not going to succeed. My second point is in relation to the war. The war was not inevitable. I think you made the point, and then sometimes you didn't make the point. I listened to the one side of the argument. In other words, that all the factors were put in place. Even at the very last minute, there was a deal on the table which could have actually led to a resolution. And just remember that Zelensky said, and most of the world said, that actually the war was not inevitable. It was never going to happen. It would be so reckless to engage in a war that it wouldn't happen. And so it's hard with that context to then say, well, that the West precipitated the war. Yes, there were all those factors, but I think the point in relation to markets is critical. The EU is the most powerful magnet for all European states, large and small, and even for Russia itself, which was so engrossed in the German, economy and its provision. So what we've seen is massive destruction of the productive forces, a huge burden that's been put on the global south through this war, a reckless pursuit, of national interests and imperial interests in relation into Russia. Now, I want to turn towards the Russian state. The fact that we had this extraordinary development of Wagner, is quite something. It wasn't as though it was an auxiliary force, and a force to do all the dirty tricks, which the West has always used mercenaries for. And from Africa, we know all about that. But it was the cutting edge of the Russian military intervention, which was heralded and praised, and it was almost the favorite military institution. Where in the world have we seen in a modern state a complete dependence, or such dependence, I wouldn't say complete dependence, but dependence on such a force on a mercenary basis, in other words, for money? and that this should be used with turning out the jails, the prisons and so forth, putting troops into semi-suicidal positions. I think there has been some excellent reporting. If you look at the New Yorker recently, one of their reporters was, I think, in the field for about a month with Ukrainian troops. And these Ukrainian troops just said, this is absolutely crazy. And I believe it. I'm not saying that everything you appear but I have military experience myself, and I could imagine that these troops were just running at them in a human wave and actually being cut down almost to pieces. But at the end, no one had expected such recklessness in the field, and to some extent they managed to be able to make the gains, or at least to hold what they had, and to be able to make such gains. But that's not a military strategy. That's not a way in which a war can be done. And it's true, in the beginning we saw an invasion, and it was a formidable invasion in this sense, because they put in huge troop carriers right in near Kyiv to be able to bring in masses of troops. And they could see that that huge troop carrier, lying broken, in the field. Now, every person in the left in South Africa, I wouldn't say every person, but just about everyone, laughed themselves to tears that Zelensky was being offered a helicopter out, and he's already gone. He's not gone. I mean, that's an astonishing fact. Even the CIA never expected such resistance. In other words, Putin has made mistake number one. Whatever he thought about a Ukrainian state and a Ukrainian nation and their right to exist, he's created it. He's created a sense of national identity like none before. He's actually led to devastating losses. I'm not saying that all the losses that have been attributed, the 100,000, maybe that, the West has said, well, maybe that's not quite true. But the BBC has done extensive investigation and come up with a name of 22,000. And most of those are troops between the age of 18 to 22. And those, they photographed the funerals and all the rest of it. And so the evidence is in there that has been devastating losses to young people, many of whom were anti-war and are now fleeing for their lives. The brighter ones who've got the money are actually wanting to get the hell out of us, out of the system. That's a mistake. Mistake number two, the various countries of Eastern Europe, which have had the most horrific experience of Russian invasion, at that time it was the Soviet Union, and occupation, are actually more have been pressing the United States, which was very reluctantly supporting NATO. And NATO was in a bit of a shambles, before all this happened. Trump was anti-NATO in the sense he didn't want to pay for it unless they paid for it themselves. It was up to them if they wanted it. And so there was no enthusiasm for NATO. There's certainly no war mood in Europe at that time. And the idea that NATO would even last for much longer was I wouldn't say it was inevitable it would fall apart, but it wasn't strong. Now, we've seen Finland, Sweden, even Switzerland apparently wanting to line up to get into NATO. Now, to me, that's not a success. It's the evidence of a mistake, some calculation about the balance of forces, which has actually been quite wrong. Just a final points, in relation to Wagner. Now, we've had our Wagners in South Africa. In South Africa, our Wagner was called Koevoet, Koevoet. That is crowbar. And that crowbar was meant to smash the heads in, of quote unquote terrorists. In other words, communists, or anyway, people like me. So, they were then allowed and given a kind of a sphere of work to do. They were ex-military or military people all mixed in, and they did their own thing, more or less as Wagner did. But they were devastating, they were cruel, and they were beyond the law. And eventually they were wound up even before the ANC came to power. Why? Because of the intense hostility that there was in South Africa. also among ordinary troops. And I was one of the ordinary troops, and we hated those bastards. We knew what they were up to, and they were bringing our country into well, devastation. And I imagine that many of the Russian troops were feeling the same way. Maybe that's why Putin had to disassemble Wagner and try and absorb it. But I think his ambitions were more to try and avoid the popularity that Wagner got, because, I mean, they challenged him, and they'd got away with it. Now, I think there is a certain ricketiness. There's a certain imbalance, you know, in the Russian state. I do not believe that Putin can carry on quite as before. As you say, an authoritarian is such a polite word for the term, but it's an autocratic regime. You know, is not necessarily a stable one, and people know that. This is not stable in the sense that Gramsci talked about the earthworks of capitalist society. In other words, around the nucleus of the state, the army, the men with arms, you know, all kinds of earthworks, which are the church, the professional groups, the municipalities of note, various independent aspects of civil society, which are conservative in the sense of conserving, you know, traditions and all the rest of it, not reckless, and actually generally trying to put out revolution even before the state intervenes by offering an alternative hegemony rather than just brutal state force. I think that Putin has actually, you know, led to the weakening of the state. It's true, it's stronger in the sense that maybe they can put people into prison. But Navalny actually laughed when he was put in prison. It seemed, I'm not saying I'm an admirer, but let's just imagine, no one laughed when they got prison in South Africa, because you know what, you know, that seemed to have some resilience in terms of the white population. Maybe in Russia, people don't expect it, you know, to last that long. How this will all turn out, you know, really, you know, we have to exercise our minds. But I do feel that miscalculation of the balance of forces has actually taken place, and that what we've seen, the resilience in Ukraine before NATO got involved, really, I mean, to any of the great extent, is what's happening. We are seeing a war of attrition rather than a war of maneuver, although the original earlier Ukrainian counter-offensive was extraordinarily successful. But now, of course, if you look at the battle embankments and battlefield embankments and so forth, it seems much more of a slog. But it's a slog which actually Ukraine cannot let go, and also which Russia cannot let go. It's true that the states would like to move on to China, but actually in this sense, you know, the American imperialism is actually backing off to some extent on China. I'm not saying it therefore has backed off, but it's seeking out every possible way, because they know that the alliance between Russia and China is extremely brittle. It's not a dependable and durable relation. Once we break with fossil fuels, once we turn towards renewables and actually start addressing the climate change, and if the world people see this as an alternative, really Russia is a past tense state. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, David. Harry.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I'll try to take about a quarter of that time we've just had from David, but anyway.
Good.
Look, yeah, look, I want to start with events of the last 2 weeks, because the negotiated where Lukashenko intervened and obviously gave exile to Prigozhin in Belarus. We now know that well, what has happened to the Wagner Group? And this is, it'd be interesting to see what Richard says about this, because obviously whether some of them or indeed all of them have conscribed into the Russian army, or what appears to have happened is that there's a base, a military base now been established in Belarus that possibly will come under the control of the command of Lukashenko. Now, I don't expect Wagner to fire another shot in Ukraine. I think they're out of the picture. But what I wonder what Richard thinks of this new base. Is this perhaps for the interests of Lukashenko? Would Lukashenko be using this, perhaps in the Ukraine war, perhaps outside it, and so on? And secondly, is this new warlord, the Chechen leader, who seems to be the one in favor, that Putin is in favor, Kadyrov, how important is he? Is he going to be the new Prigozhin in the war in Ukraine and elsewhere? The second point really comes back, I mean, I've listened to Finn's remarks, and I think this is what we see a problem in the left, because many people, and I've noticed this, is that people get confused about what the war is about. And they've got tied into recent events, if you want, the recent aggression, which was the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, Western media, atrocities that have been taking place. And there's no question there have been atrocities carried out by the Russian army. No one's denying that for a moment. But I think what happens is people lose sight about what the war is about. So it's like the Vietnam War. Many people believe America won the Vietnam War. In a sense, they did. Their objective was to turn the fastest rising economy in Asia, which was oriented towards the Soviet Union, and destroy it, destroy the state. That was achieved by America in the Vietnam War. And this war, you have to look at what the war is about. Now, I haven't got time to go back. You go back to 1992 after the collapse.
Harry, can you hear us? I think we might have to come back to Harry when he's got his connection back. Okay.
Roger,
Oh, here you are. Okay.
Can I finish my point, Roger? I'll be quick.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we lost you for a moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that. Look, the war, I mean, the movement and the progression of NATO goes back to 1992. Fast forward, I mean, the 9/11 wars was the invasion of America by countries that you well know now, Iraq, Libya, so on and so on. And now we have, under the Obama administration, the aim was to move and expand NATO in Europe. And we've moved to the position that we are today. Now, the intervention in Ukraine. Now, Richard said that Ukraine effectively hasn't won the war. No, Russia hasn't won the war. But you see, America already has got what they want out of the war. When you look at the Ukrainian Recovery Conference that took place only a few months ago, it goes back to 2018. It was known as the Ukrainian Reform Conference. But the Recovery Conference has already decided that any new development inside Ukraine, American corporations will purchase all the rich resources that are in Ukraine. And oil, gas, precious metals, things like diamonds and so on, is now going to be under American control. That is what this war is about. It doesn't matter. The Ukrainian people have been used as cannon fodder in order to advance American imperialist interests. Even as we speak today, I mean, Zelensky is already complaining about the F-16 jet fighters. These were promised to come into the country. He's complaining that the West are stalling on the F-16 jet fighters. The aim of the West is not to bring the war to an end. Richard has dealt that. In fact, the last proposal to end the war, or proposal to cause it, came from China. And that was in February of this year. China proposed a peace settlement for Ukraine, respect UN principles, a ceasefire, establish a balanced EU security architect, and end all unilateral sanctions. That was opposed by the West. The aim is to keep the war going. And that makes, in order not to arm Zelensky to end the war, nor for that matter, lose the war. And that really takes us to the continuing strategy. Now, Richard says that it could possibly be for the overthrow of Putin inside Russia. That may well be the case. What the West needs is what they've needed all along. Sanctions to carry on, to build up NATO forces, and to build up NATO plus. And that is attracting countries like the fastest growing economy in the world at the moment is India. Attracting India, they're already supplying India with rather cheap weapons on the world scale to bring India towards the NATO war. Other countries as well, Saudi Arabia and so on is the one. This is building up for the much bigger picture. It's going on the same on the eastern side, China, Russia, Syria, Iran, also becoming a nuclear force, and so on. We're moving up to a global conflict between two sides that could spark, and of course Taiwan, what's happening there. Exactly the same, if you want intimidation or threats to de-escalate the situation from American diplomats, even former prime ministers in Britain, Liz Truss, are all there to create more tension in Taiwan in order to spark or to bring China into the war. I think we should be fully aware that this strategy in Ukraine aim is to spread it to Russia, to spread it also to China, is the advancement of imperialism, US imperialism. I think the problem for the anti-war movement at the moment is that consciousness has not reached any level where we are seeing significant opposition. You look at the Vietnam War, it took years and years to develop a consciousness before anti-war movement really developed. We haven't seen that in this yet, but largely because of the media blackout here, and of course for the people in Russia there in Western. So I think we have a long way to go before consciousness really develops and we see a movement against this imperialist war in Ukraine. Thank you, Roger.
Yeah, thank you, Harry. Balihar, you're next.
Thank you, Roger. And can I just thank Richard for a really powerful and insightful analysis of what's been going on. And in many ways, I think my comments really follow on from Harry, who just spoken there so eloquently about the nature of what this war is about. It's a proxy war which aims in many ways to a certain extent to ensure the continuation of European hegemony, and to a large extent to contain other global powers, to ensure the US unipolar world against any attempts to go away from that towards a more multipolar world. Hence why we see how the United States, Europe through NATO and other international finance institutions seek to contain and limit and weaken both Russia and China in all sorts of ways. And I am slightly puzzled, comrades, about the failure of the left to appreciate, I think, these I would have thought very simple points, but it seems that, these are seemingly very controversial points. I would just say one more thing before I ask the two particular questions that I wanted to ask, Richard. It is, colleagues, it is surprising to me, or the extent or the lack of analysis and how far this war that's been undertaken in Ukraine, the extent to which the condemnation against Russia is never leveled at the United States or other European partners when it's undertaken in other parts of the world, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, which then kind of does lead one to the road that maybe there are racist elements in this, that what's tolerable for white Europeans to do overseas in the global south is probably not so tolerable when it happens in our backyard. And I think the left needs to come to terms in how it treats people of color as well as people of white nations or white people. I've got two bigger questions that I want to ask, Richard, and kind of draws on this. One is, what are the reaction of the global South towards what's been happening in Ukraine, in particular Brazil, India, China, the Central Asian states? How do they see it? And to what extent can Russia seek to use them in leveraging support to bring about the end of the war and to bring about peace settlement? So that's a very specific question that I wanted to ask Richard. What role can countries in the global South play to achieve a speedy resolution to this and bring about, as you rightly pointed out, Richard, the devastating impact that this had on both Russia and Ukraine? And my second question is this. You rightly point out, Richard, that that after many years, after almost 30 years after the collapse of Russia, of the Soviet Union, when Russia adopted a neoliberal policy, neoliberalized policies, which was very much around trying to extract rent in various forms, oil and gas in particular, and minerals, is now seeking to industrialize itself. I suppose my question on this is, to what extent is this policy or this strategy of economic development limited by its lack of access to microchips and the various intellectual property rights that enables the hegemonic power of the United States to constrain the access of these valuable technology to third parties? So I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about that. I've just got a third question, a very short one, is this. One of the things that I heard about 4 months ago, was the fact that Ukraine is seeking to privatize a large part of its economy, or to sell up part of its state assets to outside investors. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, or would you have any information about that, and to what extent the United States or European countries are seeking to carve up Ukraine for its own gains? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, comrade. Carol, you're next.
Hi, I think what's disturbing me about this whole discussion is what really disturbs me a lot of times about WIN conversations, that it's always academic instead of seeking solutions. And I think the only person that is sort of just sought a solution was having, knocking down the United States in terms of, its unipolar, and then ultimately seeing Russia as being the bulwark against American imperialism, which is really, in my opinion, has nothing to do with reality. This is an inter-imperialist crisis. This is an inter-imperialist war. The whole world is going to be and is being impacted by the war, not only Russia, not only Ukraine, but Africa is starving because it's not getting the food that it normally gets from both Ukraine and Russia. The world is becoming more and more polluted. And the fact that Richard could say we don't want a nuclear war, when in fact, that's exactly where we're headed. And the only way to change that is to have workers turn their guns around, both against Ukraine and against Russia, and start talking about, a world where workers control society, where we have a workers overthrowing capitalism. And I have not heard that either in this discussion and unfortunately in many of the discussions that Wynne has. And so there's no programmatic way to move forward because nobody talks about overthrowing capitalism. It's all interesting academic points, all of which I agree with. This is a proxy war. The United States wants to fight against China, wants to against Russia. This is, NATO, and NATO is certainly, anybody who disagrees with the fact that NATO has pushed for this. The United States has demanded that Zelensky not have any peace talks with Russia because the United States then, so the budget for American, for the GDP for military arms is $900 billion a year. Somebody is profiting. The United States military is profiting, and Russia, who is somewhat weaker, also wants to maintain its role in the world imperialist society. How are we going to change this? How do we resolve this? By having everything that mostly everybody knows already. So why aren't we putting forward a perspective that the international working class needs to overthrow capitalism, that we need to fight against American imperialism, against American arms, against American capitalism, and that the international working class in Russia, there are 1 million people who have left Russia. There was an opposition movement that was happening. There are people who ended up in jail. There are obviously people in Russia who are in opposition to the war, but are fearful of going to jail or being shot as traitors. And so, we can talk about the Russia. I mean, I think Russia and the Wagner Group are obviously part and parcel of the same thing. The Wagner Group was in Africa, stole diamonds, rubies, and helped support Russian imperialism. What are we talking about? Why are we could end up in a nuclear war. Why are we not talking about how to end this war? And because the United States is not ever going to give up its position, and because it controls things. And so the American working class has to look towards getting rid of the American ruling class, but Russia is not the savior. China is not the savior of the world working class. So it's time that the left start talking about those kinds of things instead of just reiterating the same thing over and over again. We have to end capitalism. That's the only way to end the war. Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Carol. Comrade Jan from Sweden, and then Ian. You there, Jan? I had a message on chat that he wanted to participate. Are you there?
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, thank you, Richard, for your lead off. It certainly sparked a discussion, a very interesting discussion. Well, I think that this mutiny of Prigozhin have weakened the regime of Putin, because it wasn't just, the combination of what he did and what he said was really humiliating, not just for Putin himself, but also for the top brass of the military. He said that the war was being conducted in the wrong way. And then he went on to say that the invasion of Ukraine was being done because of the wrong reason. And then in the last days, he talked about corruption, bureaucracy, inefficiency, not only in relation to how the war was being conducted, but also in a broader sense. And these are things that the ordinary people in Russia experience every day. And if you want the political program in Russia today, what more do you want than saying that we invaded Ukraine for the wrong reason? We are conducting the war in a corrupt, bureaucratic and inefficient way. I mean, you don't have to say so much more than that. That is, I mean, he presented himself as an alternative, and then his actions. As far as I know, he took the military command that was leading the Russian day-to-day military operations in Ukraine as a hostage in Rostov. He took them as a hostage, and then because of this situation, he could move. They were not 25,000, maybe 3,000 or 4,000, I don't know, but not definitely not 25,000. But he could move very fast and very close to Moscow. And at least part of that was the hostage situation in Rostov. But taken all together, together with his attacks on the Minister of Defense and the High Commander, I mean, the military must have been very, very humiliated. But also to the ordinary Russian people, he said things about the war, about the hardships that nobody else have said in a way that he did. And even if Putin is still, you know, he is still in the number one position. I mean, he's not, as far as we can tell from here, weakened. But sometimes things take more than a week to play itself out. And let's say now that the Russian military can stop the Ukrainian offensive and create a stalemate, a position for us negotiations of a ceasefire. Well, then maybe it is time for the military to make a move against Putin. Unfortunately, in this situation, I think that there is no organized opposition. Now, that doesn't mean that the military is unsensitive for human, for all for workers, for all other people in Russia. The military is they, to some extent, even they have Fingerspitzgefühl. Yeah. So I don't believe for a moment that Putin is as strong as before. He is weakened. I can't imagine anything else. I want to finish with some points. We cannot get into a position where the enemies of our enemies becomes our friends. And the United States, the imperialist country number one, are our enemy. And Putin is obviously an enemy to the United States. But we must be able to think two things at the same time. We are both enemies to the United States and to Putin. In Sweden, talking about the media blackout, to advance a demand like a ceasefire is becoming more or less something like a high treason. It's more or less a revolutionary. I'm saying this with a kind of laugh, but you see, we who advanced the slogan of a ceasefire, we are becoming hammered because the media is so much, we are going to join NATO, and we can, the democracy in Sweden is becoming weakened because everything is, everybody is lining up to support Sweden joining NATO. So demands like a ceasefire is not revolutionary in the, you know, in October 1917 Russia sense, but it's extremely important that somebody is putting forward the demand of a ceasefire. And of course, I do agree. I think it was Finn who said that Russia should withdraw. But today it seems like that would be a futile demand. The demand that really is the breaking point for the left is a ceasefire. But you can, the former Stalinist party do not advance that slogan. And the situation is really bad in Sweden in this question, in this, when it comes to the war, because the NATO is sort of militarizing, quote unquote, the discussion in Sweden. But we cannot, and I will finish with that, we cannot end up in a position where the enemy to our enemy is our friends. We must, remain conscious that the US is enemy number one, but Russia is also an imperialist state in relation to its neighbors. And in that sense, it is just like 1917. Russia was under the thumb of Western imperialism, but it was still suppressing its neighbors. Yeah. And today it is the same. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Well, look, we're running a little late. I'm going to take two more contributions, one Ian and one me, but both, even me, I'm afraid, have got to be fairly brief because we have to give Richard enough time to answer the huge number of questions and points of contention. So, Ian, you're next.
Okay, I'll be as brief as I can, and I'll leave you in the good hands of the chair for him to wind us both in if needs be. But no, I've in all seriousness, I think I can be brief. It's been an excellent discussion, an excellent lead off, I must say, another one that should be shared far and wide. I do agree a lot more with Richard's perspective, I have to say, than Finn's, but without relitigating every single point of that because time's tight. I'd just like to make the point about the putsch itself. That the Wagner Group situation in Russia seems, as I just said in the comments, in some ways very similar to the RSF situation in Sudan, as well as the fact that they're apparently even working together in Sudan. The difference is that it's been contained for now within days. We'll see what happens, but it's not descended into civil war in the way that the West were openly hoping for this time last week, whereas in Sudan it has descended into civil war. In some ways, those civil war is stalemated as Ukraine itself. Obviously, I mentioned in the chat about BlackRock or Black Water in Iraq and various paramilitary mercenary groups that the West has used too, but it wasn't them that were marching on Washington when that actually did happen in January 6th, a couple of years ago. So this is something quite different in Russia. Where I could see it happen again, another country that's got a very similar situation to both Russia and Sudan, and this is a kind of question to Richard, is in Ukraine itself, where they've deputized the Azov battalion and other gangs of far-right thugs. They've been actually integrated into the army as opposed to Wagner until recently not being. So that's a technical difference. But I think in both cases, you've got very politically motivated groups of far-right armed men that could cause a real problem. And in terms of the Ukrainians, I've just read an article recently about how it's becoming a magnet for far-rightists across Europe. It could be like the Mujahideen, what happens when all these guys come home. One of the reasons Zelensky didn't move towards the peace program that he was elected on was that they threatened to kill him back in 2019. So the effects of whatever comes next could be very destabilizing in Ukraine itself. It's not credit, but maybe a point in which it shows that the West is worse. It doesn't seem that Russia's openly pushing for that, whereas the West was openly pushing for that to happen in Russia, are still saying that once Kasparov saying that once the Ukrainian flags raised over Sevastopol, which is at the very bottom of the Crimean Peninsula, then the army back home in Russia will not like to see Putin still being around. Of course, the issue of Ukraine retaking Crimea especially seems to me against the rights of nations and national groups to self-determination. That these issues must be addressed through negotiation and plebiscite rather than military conquest of people who don't want to be in Ukraine, certainly not in Ukraine of 2014, let alone the one that's been forged more recently. Finally, just on the Bund itself, this is what NATO quite openly were pushing for: bleed Ukraine to wear down Russia and lead to a regime change. Maybe they thought it would be a kind of neoliberal color revolution, but that was always less likely. I think the Russian anti-war movement were incredibly brave in the initial phase. I hope they come back, but since April last year, as well as the repression, it seems that the way the West have been scuppering the chance of peace have, if anything, undermined them and proven Putin right to sections of the population that could otherwise have been won over. So it is the angry patriots that will be the challenge to Putin at this stage, and that's very scary. An ultra pro-war, far-right uprising. Be careful what you wish for, both from our perspective, obviously, but even from the West's itself. And to muddy that water just slightly, Prigozhin making also some of the pro-NATO talking points in the last few days. They're mercenaries. The West has got more money. There seem to have been possible discussions, but that doesn't totally undercut the argument too. It's a kind of blowback we've had before in other conflicts. Saddam started off as a Western asset too, and that's basically, that's it. That's what I want to say.
Yep, thank you. Thanks, Ian. Sorry I had to cut you short. Look, I'm going to give Hamid, if you can come in very, very quickly. Hamid from Pakistan. But you have to just limit yourself because we're running out of time. And I want a couple of words. Yeah, come on.
Thank you, Comrade Roger. I will focus on the war only. And I was completely happy with Comrade Richard, as he said about war, that it is an imperialist war. We should do something against the war and for peace. But as the left is weak internationally, so we cannot align ourselves any part of the war, whether towards Russia or towards Ukraine. As Comrade has described, that what are the ambitions of United States and NATO, and at the other side, what are the ambitions of Russia. I think it will be a real extremism if someone support Russia or support Ukraine for the name of defending their country, their foreign, their sovereign country. And as some international Marxist organizations went so far, and they are saying that Ukraine army is a revolutionary army, and they are fighting against aggressors. And at the same time, we are observing that Ukraine has its regime, Zelensky regime, has prohibited Marxism, socialism, Leninism on every level, that no one can talk about socialism, and they have prohibited even Russian language, and aligning ourselves any such like fascists like Ukrainians, the ISIS and other fundamentalists are fighting besides them. So, as a Marxist, I think we should remind ourselves the First and Second World War and other many wars which were part in the history, and what were the stands of Marxists and comrades. So, in short, I am concluding my discussion on the point that if the left is weak, we cannot eradicate the capitalism in Russia and Ukraine. We have not such force which can fight against these regimes and these capitalist states to eradicate them. But we have to correct our ideas and analyze it. That if we cannot fight it, then what would be the consequences or result of this war? In one aspect, if we analyze that when Zelensky said, despite that is the war of expansion of NATO and American imperialism, that is also correct, and that is ground reality. But despite that, when Zelensky said that if we won the war, then we will turn the Ukraine into a new Israel, a new Zionist state. And if we lose the war, then we will turn the Ukraine into new Afghanistan, where the new cancer on the world in the Eastern Europe, we will create that. So I think that we cannot support or align ourselves with Ukraine in any form. So I think that we should not stand with any part of these states who are engaged in war. We should be against the war, and to some extent, if Russia loses the war, it means that the hegemony of America would be more powerful, and neoliberalism will come more strengthened, and that will beat all the world. So these were some of my comments. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Hamid. Look, I'm going to speak very briefly. I don't think I ever want to be chair of such a discussion before, because I had loads of things I wanted to say, and I'm going to have very little time. So all I want to say, first of all, a lot of the discussion has been on the Ukraine war, and of course it's impossible to separate the events that were the focus of our discussion from the context of the Ukraine war. We will be having a full discussion on the Ukraine war at our coming conference in September, which I think all the comrades know about. Do come, do participate, preferably in person, but in any case online. I just want to say one thing. I mean, just to make it clear, my position on the Ukraine war is that we can support neither side, that our position has to be one of socialist internationalism. I think that from the point of view of the war aims of NATO and the USA, it's part of a global strategy which has been maturing over a couple of decades, and it is in preparation for a future war with China, the need to weaken Russia, and the need to encircle it by expanding NATO onto the borders of Russia. But I also think, from the point of view of Putin, he's adopted the most reactionary stance that is possible, and has said in so many words that Ukraine was an artificial creation by the Bolsheviks, and that it should be, in effect, it should be abolished as an independent nation. And that is really a return to the politics of Tsarism, of the prison house of nations, as Lenin described it. As far as we're concerned, we should support neither side. As a matter of fact, the war could be ended tomorrow by a guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality and genuine self-determination for the peoples of Donbass and of Crimea. And I think that the slogans we should be putting forward are: Russia hands off Ukraine, immediate withdrawal of the occupation forces, no trust in NATO, oppose all sanctions, arms supplies, and escalation of the war, solidarity with the people of Ukraine in defense of their democratic rights, self-determination for the peoples of Donbass and Crimea on the basis of a genuinely democratic referendum, mutual demilitarization of the border territories on either side, and above all, unity of the workers of Russia and Ukraine to overthrow their corrupt, reactionary oppressors. Now, I just want to say one thing back to the immediate issue of today's discussion about this coup. After all, we've seen that it suited Putin to give a license to this, to his former cook, the gangster jailbird, the former burger seller in Petersburg, I believe, who under his patronage had enjoyed a free hand to amass huge wealth through extortion, blackmail, and thuggery. And it suited Putin to give him license to deploy his murderous forces in Syria and several African countries as deniable surrogates. And in Ukraine, I think that Putin had expected to meet little or no resistance to what he seriously, what he named and seriously considered as a, quote, special military operation, because he thought, like in Crimea, that he would not meet much of resistance. But he found that he got a surprise with the resistance that was mounted, and of course with all the assistance of the USA and of NATO, he found that he had no option with an army which had large numbers but low morale and largely obsolescent weaponry, that he had no option to accept Prigozhin's offer. And Prigozhin recruited an army of desperados from the prisons, which are utter hellholes, with an offer they couldn't refuse. Sign up, and once you survived 6 months, you get your freedom. But the only catch was the odds of surviving 6 months were not very good. And the only catch, inevitably, there have been constant reports of rivalry, hostility, and even open shootouts between the regular soldiers and Prigozhin's mercenaries. But I think just my final point, that surely the truth about Putin's iron rule has been exposed. I agreed very much with one thing that Richard said at the beginning, that Putin, rather than being a kind of tyrant, is it's a regime which balances between different interests. But that is actually the classic definition of a Bonapartist regime, as opposed to, if you like, a tyranny or a fascist regime, that he's balancing continually between different forces in order to stay on top. But the truth about his rule, surely, is that it rests in the end on a vacuum. Russia is a power to be reckoned with solely on the basis of two major assets, oil on the one side and armaments on the other. And its vast accumulated military armory, inherited from Soviet times, gives it a kind of exaggerated bargaining power. But apart from that, it's a precarious balance of rival corrupt warlords on the verge of degenerating into a failed state. And I agree with Ian's parallel with Sudan. It sounds far-fetched, but actually in both cases, the ruling oligarchy have felt obliged to deploy an unaccountable private army of cutthroat thugs alongside the official military hierarchy, and inevitably it descended eventually into a war for the spoils. Look, there is a lot more I would have wished to say, but I think it's we've gone over time already, and I want to give Richard an opportunity to reply. Please, Richard, you take as long as you need, because you have a vast field to cover. And thank you for your patience. Comrade.
Thank you. I won't take, hopefully not too long, because it's impossible to respond to everything. So thank you very much for all those comments. I'll start at the end, just just to say on, yeah, absolutely. I've argued that the Putin system is a Bonapartist system. I've published it, and you're absolutely spot on there. It's an interesting phenomenon, but just slight difference, and again, this isn't to defend or attack, simply factually, that, and it's come up a few times in the discussion, Russia is in fact a far more sophisticated and developed economy than some of the comments would suggest. It's a full service economy. It's not just arms. We're talking about, clearly it's under development, it's got weaknesses and so on. I'm not trying to say anything else, but certainly, for example, 40% of the nuclear power stations being built in the world are contracted to Rosatom. It's a huge industry, and very technologically sophisticated. It's one of the world's major agricultural powers now. It wasn't before, but it's really developed, and in fact now agricultural exports far exceed those from arms exports. And I could go on. If you look at the country in terms of it's a sort of an upper middle developed society, according to World Bank, OECD statistics. So it's certainly not a vacuum in economic terms. And in fact, much of the economy, the industry, is still Soviet legacy. Yes, the sanctions have really damaged the automotive industry, automobile. Yet, again, they're making do and mend, and the Chinese are coming in big time. Before the war, China was selling about 4 or 5% were occupied the Russian car market, and it's in the space of a year and a half, it's become 30%. It's taken over the empty Ford factories outside St. Petersburg and other factories. So it's going to be a massive signification of Russian car. And yeah, I could go on and on. But bottom line, Russia is a full service economy, and I think those who underestimate its sticking power in this conflict are mistaken. Again, I can't go through everything, but I think Ian made the important point about the domestic issues within Ukraine, that as we all know, Zelensky was elected in April 2019 as the peace candidate, just as his predecessor Poroshenko was, but both became hostage to what we call the anti-capitulationist right. They became hostage to in short, to extreme nationalist, a hyper-nationalist view, which of course very much frightened the Russophone part of the population, not just in Crimea, in Donbass and elsewhere. I know plenty of people in Kiev, I won't name their names today because it'd be dangerous to do so, who have bitterly opposed the Ukrainian model of state building, way back from the 1990s, incidentally, that they argue that Ukraine should have become, to reflect its multicultural, multilingual, multi-confessional status, which was a wealth. It was not a negative, it was a positive. And yet the hyper-nationalists insisted on what I've argued is this monist vision, that Ukraine for Ukrainians are only one language, one culture, and this is the viewpoint of the Galicians, the people from Lvov and the extreme West. And this division was reflected throughout the so you're absolutely right that that the government was taken hostage. Just on Jan-Lennart Haglund's comments about, so I won't, as I say, go through the whole lot. We'll be here until midnight otherwise. But just to say that the fact that the Prigozhin forces were able to take Rostov and to march as far as about 100 kilometers south of Moscow is that Putin issued the order not to use violence. So basically, those two generals, and we know them, Yevkurov and the other one, who were sitting comfortably with Prigozhin, yes, without arms. But taken hostage is one way of putting it. But, it was all done very politely. They were allowed in. And when they left, of course, people say that the citizens were giving them flowers and cheering them. Yes, because they had achieved, from the Russian perspective, victory in Bakhmut. The soldiers themselves, they came in, they did not use violence. So in other words, they were not willing to turn their guns against other Russians. And that's important. So on all sides, Putin refused to do so. The order was not to use force to start the shooting. Of course, those poor pilots were shot down from the 4 helicopters and the observation plane, because what they hadn't understood is that Prigozhin's, the 2,000 marching to Moscow, had the Panzer anti-aircraft, and they was irresponsible. And of course, they will be forever damned in Russian eyes for having done so. So that's important. So it was, in other words, but you said so many, and people have said so many interesting things, including even to call for ceasefire in Sweden nowadays is considered counter-revolutionary of the worst order. I think that's indeed a very sad reflection of things. To end, we're heading for nuclear war. Yes, there's been a big debate within Russia. You may have heard, Sergei Karaganov, Fyodor Lukyanov, many others. And I said it within 2 weeks of this beginning of the war. There's only two ways this war is going to end: one with a Russian victory, however you define it, or nuclear war. Russia cannot lose this war. Again, this is not to endorse it. It's in fact quite the opposite. But it's simply to say that you're taking on Russia, and everybody, including some of the people in this discussion, are underestimating Russian economic and military power. By the way, talking about the military is far more effective, and Prigozhin was allowed to fight the Bakhmut fight because Zelensky decided to make his last stand there. Ukraine destroyed 2 armies there. Somebody who said that the New Yorker article, it was quite false. That was just simply propaganda. Russia did not send in the boys in waves to be slaughtered. That's exactly, the Kiev regime has got a magnificent PR campaign. 98% of what comes out of Kiev is false. It's PR. They've hired 24 PR companies in Washington, D.C. They're brilliant. Zelensky is an actor, a clown. He's brilliant at playing the public and so on. I think personally, he's a catastrophic leader. He could have averted this at all sorts of points, and he's a complete hostage and had now completely lost any autonomy vis-a-vis the political West. It's a catastrophe for the Ukrainian people. That's why I've been calling for a ceasefire to stop this pointless slaughter. The outcome, again, not to endorse it. It's a fact. You take on Russia and you're taking on one of the world's great powers. And, you may denigrate it. It's got all of its flaws and faults, which you've quite accurately identified, but it ain't going to end with any, Ukraine is destroyed as a state. I mean, how irresponsible. Those who say that Putin doesn't respect Ukrainian statehood are mistaken. Technically, he's absolutely right. Ukraine is an agglomerative state. It was put together by Lenin and Stalin, this within its existing borders. Of course, absolutely, Ukraine has a right to have a democratic, sovereign state. Of course, that's everything that we've talked about. But what it doesn't have the right to do is, just as Cuba didn't have the right in October 1962 to put nuclear weapons or to act as an offensive. And obviously, Kennedy was quite right to say, even though it was prompted by the Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, but that's another issue. It doesn't, sovereignty comes along with responsibility. And the Ukrainian governments, especially the Zelensky Poroshenko ones and the post-Maidan government, it's, when history books are written, they will say this could not have been more irresponsible, and of course sponsored by the West for the reasons that many of you have correctly outlined. Can I just on to Balahar's points? Absolutely crucial, and this is a point I should have made right at the beginning. The issue of the global South is that it's crucial. Let's just call it the South or whatever you like, because what we're seeing this war is doing, and I said the political crisis of our time, one of those aspects is that geopolitics, the world, if you like, the tectonic plates of international politics are shifting phenomenally fast. What it's done is not a catalyst. What it's done is accelerated processes which were going on. As far as so many in the so-called global South or the East or just the South, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and we're talking about very serious countries, Indonesia, Mexico, many, many more, Vietnam, and India, of course. What they're saying is that this is a war, this Russo-Ukrainian war, and the war between the political West and Russia, is the global North simply cannot get over its obsession with militarism, with violence, when we've got, and many of you have also made this point earlier on, we're facing climate change, we're facing poverty, we're facing, I think, at a time when the technological possibilities of human development, of prosperity, of building bridges, of electricity, damming the Congo River so that 6 terawatts of electricity could supply electricity to 15 countries within Africa, for normal, to take advantage of human ingenuity. Instead of which, and it's so catastrophic, we have those crazes in the global North, in Washington, Kiev, and indeed Moscow, fighting a war, a third European civil war in 100 years, well, just over, since 1914. It's so, and most of the global South, I've spoken to a lot, and I'm sure Balahar has as well. They just look at this, not just say this isn't our war, but also with contempt, that you couldn't sort out your peace after the Cold War, after the end of revolutionary socialism in the Soviet form. And, Russia was desperately looking for peace. Putin himself said, look, we have either you stop enlarging NATO or we join it. He kept saying this in his first years. The West refused, the hubristic political West with the neoconservatives and liberal internationalists and so on. So the global South is organizing. It's actually what has happened now is that the post-colonialist state system, now some 200 states in the world, 193 in the UN, has matured. And this war has put them onto the global stage. The fact that we had Ramaphosa and the delegation from Africa, and I think that was a noble move just last week. We've had China with its peace proposals. We've had Indonesia, we've had Mexico, we've had Brazil, of course. You know, so much going on. And these states are no longer peripheral states. These are now mature parts of the international state system. And they are fed up with us, our arrogance, our incompetence, our obsession with war in a global, not you guys, because you guys are actually condemning it. And but it's you know, it's so pathetic, ultimately, so pathetic and unnecessary. And the fact that these Ukrainians couldn't even make their own state. They could not reconcile themselves to the fact they have a Russophone population. They have Hungarians, they have travelers, Romanis, and many others within Ukraine, which should have become part of a constitutional civic settlement. Instead of which, for the last 30 years, you've got this hyper-nationalist band, effectively, the Banderas, who have effectively hijacked a state with the support of the West because it's used as a battering ram against Russia. Now, whether Russia is a democratic state or an authoritarian state or autocratic state, Moscow has eternal security concerns. And somebody made this point, a ceasefire, I think Hagland made this point, a ceasefire is pointless unless you can have a solution to the security dilemmas, which have become intense in Europe since the end of the Cold War, which were, you know, it wasn't just simply NATO enlargement. NATO enlargement could have taken place if we'd done it within the framework of an overarching European security framework. Of course, just on the global south, obviously the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, de-dollarization, there's so much under that rubric. So thank you, Bella, for pointing us out. You know, as for the Russian Federation and neoliberal rent, can it, deal with access to microchips? Microchips is a huge issue. That's right, and so there's huge problems. But it's, you know, they've actually taken them out from fridges and other machines. The privatization of the Ukrainian economy is another huge factor, and it's really the neoliberal, well, in other words, this Zelensky regime is using this war as an excuse to destroy organized labor, even within Ukraine. We've seen new laws and the abolition of the left parties, the banning of the Communist Party after the 2014 coup, and it was a coup. And many American scholars would say, you know, the most obvious coup ever. Anyway, we could keep going on. The Wagner Group, of course, based in, this is Harry Hutchinson, is based in Belarus, but, you know, they are now redeployed effectively to prevent and preempt a Polish-Lithuanian invasion, which could well take place at any time with British backing. So that is what they're scared about. Poland, by the way, is now calling for nuclear weapons to be deployed in Poland. So, as you say, we're on an escalatory cycle. Just to say, how stable is Putin's Russia? It's very stable. It does have the ramparts of civil society. And as somebody has pointed out, that the sanctions and everything else has consolidated support around Putin and the regime, which is now seen as a national regime defending itself against ultimately beyond class and whether one agrees with it or not, the sense that Russia's got its back to the wall. And of course, this isn't just simply Putin propaganda. You know, there is a very deep well of national, let's not even call it nationalism, patriotic elements. You know, they fought, and it goes through all the way back to Alexander Nevsky, the Mongols, the Swedish invasion, the 1709 defeat at Poltava, all of this, Napoleon, endless Napoleon invaded 1812, the Germans invaded twice the last century, and on it goes. So ultimately, when your back is to the wall, and, you know, again, not to endorse it, simply to say it's a fact that Russia will win this war. It'll be tens of thousands more deaths. When I say win it, simply in a military sense, Ukraine has destroyed 2 of its armies. The only force now left is the Western force. This is why the Poles are, you know, talking and about possibly intervening to try to save something. The Ukrainian state has destroyed itself because of its irresponsible inability to establish a framework. Putin never said, and going back to the first point, Putin never said that the Ukrainian state should not exist. When he said that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, it's something that almost every single person in Russia and in Belarus, and so many of my friends in Ukraine would say, yes, we are one people, but we are not one state. And of course, Ukraine has absolutely every right, and I've always supported it, of a democratic sovereign state to choose its own path. But the idea that Putin was initially out to destroy the Ukrainian state as part of imperialism, no, it was a security dilemma which has been building for 30 years. George Kennan has talked about it. The current head of the CIA, William Burns, warned about this when he was US ambassador to Moscow. His marvelous book, The Back Channel, is well worth looking at, in which he said this so many times. It wasn't just simply NATO enlargement. The security enlargement of a system to Russia's borders was always going to be perceived as a major threat. So it's let me go back to that first point that so Putin's would have loved a normal state on its borders, but of course after the nationalist coup of February 2014, then clearly this became, and of course even then Putin was committed to the Minsk Accords, which would have allowed Ukraine to maintain, and Putin opposed the 11th of May 2014 referendum in the two republics. So it's just simply factually the Sam I think Finn's points were just simply factually wrong, and the lead up to the war was indeed coercive diplomacy, and the military intervention with only 190,000 troops to take a country of over 40 million was absurd. The idea that they could seize it, so they assumed that there was going to be some sort of a deal either with Zelensky or some post-Zelensky regime. So I absolutely stick to that initial point, and I think history will justify it. But as I say, we are where we are, and I very much endorse those who've called for, there simply has to be some sort of a ceasefire, but it has to be within the framework which resolves those issues which gave rise to this conflict in the first place. And those of you who call for system transformation, that only by ending capitalism can you end a war, I wouldn't frame it like that. Only by ending the extraordinarily consolidated power of the military industrial complex in the political West, and the political West to understand that the world has changed, that it's more multipolar, and only then can we begin to move towards some sort of, let's not call it a democratic peace, but some sort of enduring peace which takes into account the fact that the world has become multipolar, that we should focus on genuine challenges rather than this utterly pointless, utterly stupid war, which Putin never wanted. Ukraine, of course, didn't want it, but it's irresponsibility. But who wanted it? Well, it's those, I'm afraid, that we need to think about us and our militarized political West, and that we really ought to put an end to the Cold War, end to that European civil war. And the only way to have done that was to build a pan-continental unity, not the European Union unity, but one from Vladivostok, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And finally, to let Europe look after its own destiny rather than having it dictated effectively from Washington. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, listen, I think that's been one of the most vigorous and stimulating discussions that we've had for a long time. Thank you very much, Richard. You've covered a lot of ground. You've given us a lot of information. The issues are still very controversial, but that's all the better for stimulating and sharpening our insights into the situation. So that's the end of the meeting today. I just would like to say two things before we finish. First of all, I mentioned the WIN conference, which is taking place the 9th and 10th of September in London or near London. I think everybody will have had an invitation or information about this on the meeting notices at least. Please, if you want to come, please just sign up and pay up if possible. But in any case, at least sign up your intention, whether you want to participate in person or whether you want to participate online. But please let us know. The other thing is about next week's meeting. We talked about the speed of events. You know, out of the blue, we had the Prigozhin mutiny. Out of the blue, also, we've seen this huge uprising of the youth in France. We had intended already to invite the French comrades to speak to us next week because of the to get the latest on the demonstrations on the pensions issue. But now, just in time, they've arranged an uprising for us again as well. This, so I think this is going to be a really another very important discussion. Everybody is welcome. If you're not already on our mailing list, please just indicate on the chat your email address, and I'll make sure you're on. Thanks, comrades, to everybody who participated. It's been a really useful discussion, and thank you particularly to Richard. Thanks, comrades.
Cheers.